Hey guys, tonight we begin with a place so wild, so chaotic, and so gloriously unsupervised that it makes a modern music festival in a field with no toilets look like a quiet church picnic. We are sailing all the way to the other side of the world, to colonial Australia in the 1800s, a land where the rum was currency, the soldiers were drunker than the prisoners, and the nearest functioning legal system was roughly 12,000 miles away, and frankly, not all that interested in helping you out, and a sincere thank you to the listener who suggested tonight's topic. Your ideas genuinely shape what we cover here, and this little corner of the internet only grows because of people quietly tuning in and sending suggestions exactly like this one. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, because somehow it's always 2 a.m. somewhere. And if you'd rather drift off with just your ears, the channel is now on Spotify too, with a link waiting quietly in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and maybe tuck your feet in, because in this place even the spiders have opinions. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it actually felt like to be shipped to the far side of the planet as punishment for stealing a loaf of bread? Could you survive in a colony where your boss, your judge, and your local rum dealer were somehow the same 3 men? Would you last a single week in a town with no money, no rights, and a neighbour who escaped into the bush last Tuesday and is now legally everyone's problem? Ever tried to start a brand new life with nothing but a borrowed coat and a criminal record you're not entirely sure you earned? And what exactly would you do if the closest thing to a police force spent most of its day arguing about who owned the gin? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in 1803. Somewhere on the ragged edge of the known world. You have no shoes, a horizon in every direction that quietly whispers good luck, and the growing suspicion that nobody here is coming to save you. Let's begin. Let's start at the very beginning with the master criminal act that earned you a one-way ticket to the bottom of the globe. You're probably imagining something dramatic, a daring heist, a duel at dawn, a stolen crown glittering in your pocket. The reality is far less glamorous. Most people sent to Australia were transported for petty theft, the kind of crime that today would get you a stern look and a small fine. You stole a handkerchief, you took some cheese, you borrowed a coat that technically belonged to someone else. Back in Britain, the courts were overflowing, the prisons were bursting, and someone had the genius idea to simply ship the problem somewhere far enough away that nobody would have to think about it again. That somewhere was you, and the ship is already waiting at the dock. To understand how you got here, you have to understand the legal system you were born into, which was less a justice system and more a very enthusiastic punishment machine. By the early 1800s, there were over 200 offences in Britain that could technically get you hanged. Stealing goods worth more than a few shillings, poaching a rabbit, cutting down a tree that wasn't yours, being in the company of the wrong people. The law was so eager to execute people for so little that judges and juries actually started softening sentences just to avoid hanging someone over a stolen spoon, and that softer option, the merciful one, was transportation. So instead of the gallows, you get a sentence. 7 years if you're lucky, 14 if you're not, and for some unfortunate souls, the rest of your natural life. 7 years sounds almost manageable until you remember it includes an 8-month voyage each way and absolutely no plan to ever bring you back. Transportation wasn't a prison term with a return ticket. It was a polite official way of saying goodbye forever. Here's the part that really stings. Britain used to ship its convicts to America, dumping them quietly onto the colonies and considering the matter closed. Then the Americans had their revolution, declared independence, and made it very clear they were no longer accepting deliveries. Suddenly Britain had a growing pile of prisoners and nowhere to put them. The prisons filled up. Then they started using old decommissioned ships called hulks anchored in the rivers, rotting, overcrowded and rancid as floating jails. You might spend months in one of these stinking wooden coffins before your ship even left, packed in with the sick, the desperate and the genuinely dangerous, all marinating together in the dark. It did not matter much who you actually were. The system did not pause to consider whether you were a hardened criminal or a starving teenager who took bread because the alternative was watching your family go hungry. Children as young as 9 were transported. Men and women, first-time offenders and repeat troublemakers, all funneled into the same overcrowded pipeline pointed at the far side of the planet. The courtroom barely blinked. A few minutes of proceedings, a sentence read aloud, and your entire future was rewritten by people who would forget your name before lunch. And so, here you stand, clutching whatever you were allowed to keep, listening to the creak of the ship that will carry you away from everything you have ever known. You're not a monster. You're not a mastermind. You're a person who made a small mistake in a country that had run out of patience and room. The crime was minor, but the consequence is an ocean, and that ocean is about to swallow you whole. Speaking of which, it's time to climb aboard, because the worst part of this entire ordeal is just beginning. So you've been sentenced, and now comes the part nobody warned you about, the trip. This is not a relaxing ocean cruise with a buffet and a man playing the violin. This is 8 months crammed into the damp wooden belly of a convict ship, chained below deck with several hundred strangers who are all just as confused, seasick and resentful as you are. The air is thick enough to chew, the food is questionable on a good day, and biological warfare on a bad one. Storms toss the ship like a cat playing with a toy, and the only entertainment is guessing which illness will reach you first. By the time land appears on the horizon, you've forgotten what the sun looks like, and you smell like something that should be buried, not disembarked. Let's start with your accommodation, a generous word for the section of the ship known as the convict deck. Picture a low wooden space with barely enough headroom to sit upright, divided into rows of cramped berths where you and your fellow prisoners are stacked like cargo. Because to the people running this operation, that is exactly what you are. There is no privacy, no fresh air worth mentioning, and the only light comes from whatever leaks through the gratings above, which are usually locked. When the weather turns rough, those gratings are sealed entirely, trapping you below in the dark with the smell, the noise, and the rising panic of hundreds of people who cannot get out. And the smell, oh, the smell. Imagine the worst public bathroom you've ever encountered. Then remove the ventilation, add the contents of several hundred seasick stomachs, sprinkle in unwashed bodies, bilge water, and the lingering ghost of every meal anyone has failed to keep down, then seal it in a wooden box for the better part of a year. By month 3, your nose has either given up entirely or filed a formal complaint. There is no escaping it. The stench soaks into the wood, into your clothes, into you. Food, such as it is, arrives as salted meat hard enough to chip a tooth. Biscuits so infested with weevils you eventually decide the weevils are just extra protein, and a thin allowance of water that often tastes like the barrel it came in. Scurvy stalks the deck because fresh fruit is a fantasy out here, turning gums spongy and old wounds fresh again. Dysentery sweeps through with horrifying ease, and in the cramped, filthy conditions, a single sick prisoner can become 20 in a matter of days. Some voyages lost a handful of people. The truly notorious ones lost a quarter of everyone aboard. Their bodies slipped quietly over the side with little ceremony and even less mourning. The motion of the ship is its own special torture. When the seas turn violent, the entire world becomes a heaving, groaning, lurching nightmare. You're thrown against the timbers, your stomach rebels, and the chains that bind you offer no comfort and plenty of bruising. There is nothing to do but endure it, hour after hour, day after day, while the ocean reminds you in great heaving swells exactly how small and powerless you have become. Through all of it, there is the crushing boredom in between the terror, the endless grey sameness of sky and sea, the slow realization that home is gone and getting further away with every wave. You measure time not in days but in survival, ticking off each sunrise as proof you made it through another one. And then, finally, impossibly, a smudge of land appears on the horizon. Relief floods through you, sweet and warm. You have survived the voyage. Unfortunately, nobody has told you yet what is actually waiting on that shore. You stagger off the ship, blinking like a mole that took a wrong turn, expecting at the very least a building or two. Instead, you are greeted by what can only be described as a work in progress. The colony is a scattering of tents, mud, and panic clinging to the edge of a continent that clearly did not ask for visitors. There are no shops, no roads worth the name, and no comforting sense that anyone in charge has a plan. The soil refuses to grow familiar crops, the supplies are already running low, and everyone seems to be quietly doing the math on how long the food will last. This is not a fresh start. This is a survival situation that someone optimistically labelled a town. The first thing that hits you after the smell of the ship finally fades is just how staggeringly unprepared everyone is. The people who planned this colony, sitting comfortably back in Britain, imagined a tidy little settlement that would more or less run itself. They sent tools that broke, seeds that wouldn't sprout, and livestock that promptly wandered off into the bush, never to be seen again. They sent convicts who had been pickpockets and labourers in crowded cities, not one of whom had the faintest idea how to clear land or farm in soil and seasons that behaved nothing like the ones back home. It is a bit like being handed a survival manual written entirely in a language nobody present can read. Then there is the land itself, which seems personally offended by your arrival. The summer heat is relentless and bone dry, baking the earth into something more like brick than soil. The trees are enormous, ancient and stubbornly difficult to cut down, their wood-blunting axes faster than anyone can sharpen them. Strange animals bound, slither and screech in every direction, and not a single one looks like anything in the books. You quickly learn that almost everything here can either bite you, sting you, or simply ignore you while you slowly fall apart. Food, predictably, becomes an obsession almost immediately. The supplies brought from Britain were only ever meant to last until the colony could feed itself, and since the colony cannot feed itself, a grim arithmetic sets in. Rations are cut, then cut again, then cut. In the worst stretches, the entire settlement teeters on the edge of starvation, every set of eyes scanning the empty horizon for the sails of a supply ship that is months late and may not be coming at all. People grow thin, tempers grow short. The cheerful idea of a thriving new colony curdles into the daily question of whether anyone will be alive to see next year. And looming over all of it is the sheer, dizzying isolation. You're about as far from home as it is physically possible to be without leaving the planet. A letter, if you could even write one, would take the better part of a year to arrive, and the same again for any reply. There is no help coming quickly. no reinforcements over the next hill, no familiar institution to lean on. Whatever happens here, happens to you, and you alone get to deal with it. So you look around at the mud, the tents, the exhausted faces, and the great indifferent wilderness pressing in from every side, and something settles in your gut. This was never going to be a punishment you simply waited out. This is a place you're going to have to wrestle into something livable with your own 2 hands. And speaking of your hands, the authorities have already noticed they are not currently busy, which brings us neatly to the small matter of your new occupation. Now that you've arrived, it's time to discover your exciting new career, which is best summarized as whatever needs doing, immediately, forever. There's no application process, no interview, and absolutely no salary. As a convict, your labor belongs to the colony, which means you're clearing land, hauling timber, breaking rocks, and building the very settlement that's holding you prisoner. The hours are sunrise to sunset, the tools are basic, and the supervision ranges from indifferent to actively hostile. If you're lucky, you might be assigned to a settler who treats you like cheap help rather than livestock. If you're unlucky, well, the colony has many uses for a body and very little interest in how that body feels about it. The work itself is brutal in a way that office workers and modern complainers can scarcely imagine. Clearing land means attacking enormous, deeply rooted trees with hand tools, dragging out stumps that seem cemented into the earth, and turning wild bush into something resembling a field, one aching swing at a time. Building means quarrying and hauling stone, mixing mortar, and raising structures with muscle and rope, where today we would simply press a button on a machine. Road building means moving the landscape itself, basket by basket, in heat that makes the air shimmer. Your back learns new ways to hurt that you did not previously know existed. There are, broadly, 2 fates available to you. The first is the government work gangs, where you labour directly for the colony alongside other convicts, overseen by men whose entire job is to make sure you never stop. The second is assignment, where you're handed over to a free settler or an officer to work on their farm or in their household. Assignment can be a relief or a nightmare depending entirely on who you draw. A reasonable master might feed you decently and treat you like a hired hand. A cruel one can work you to exhaustion, withhold your rations, and report you for the smallest offence, knowing the punishment will not fall on him. The genuinely maddening part is the complete absence of anything you would recognise as rights. You cannot quit. You cannot negotiate. You cannot point out that the workload is impossible or the treatment unfair, because there is no one to point it out to who cares. Your time is not your own. Your effort is not rewarded, and the fruits of all that labour flow upward to people who will never so much as learn your name. It is the worst job in the world, with the worst boss in the world, and a resignation letter that would be answered with a flogging. And yet, oddly, this system contained a faint flicker of possibility, which is more than the prisoners back in the rotting hulks ever had. Work hard, keep your head down, avoid trouble, and you might eventually earn a ticket of leave, a kind of conditional freedom that let you work for yourself and live more or less as you pleased, provided you stayed in the colony. Serve out your full sentence and you became an emancipist, technically free, even if society would never quite let you forget where you started. For the genuinely fortunate and the genuinely stubborn, the colony could, in time, become not just a prison, but a place to actually build a life. But that is a distant dream for a future version of you. The present version is blistered, sunburnt, and being told to dig faster. And here is the thing about a system that owns your body and resents your existence. The moment you slow down, talk back, or are simply accused of either. That system has a very particular way of responding, and it does not involve a written warning. Let's talk about discipline, because the colony has very strong feelings about it and almost no patience for nuance. Break a rule, real or imagined, and the punishment is often the lash, delivered in public so everyone gets the message at once. Floggings were handed out for offences as small as talking back, working too slowly, or simply being in a bad mood at the wrong moment. The number of strokes could climb into the dozens, and the experience left scars that lasted a lifetime, assuming you kept yours. There were no appeals, no second opinions, and no human resources department to file a complaint with. In this colony, the rules were simple: obey, endure, and try very hard not to attract attention. The instrument of all this enthusiasm was the cat of nine tails, a whip with multiple knotted cords designed to do as much damage as possible with each stroke. It earned its name, honestly, because it tore at the skin like claws. The condemned man was tied to a wooden frame, often called the triangle, arms stretched up and bound so he could not move, his back bared to the sun and to the crowd. Then the counting began, and it was always counted aloud, slowly, deliberately, so everyone present understood exactly how long this was going to take. The sentences were savage by any standard. 25 lashes was considered a light penalty, almost a formality. 50 was serious. 100 or more was the kind of punishment that could cripple a man or kill him outright, and these heavier sentences were handed down with disturbing regularity. The official record-keeping was meticulous, every stroke logged in neat ledgers as if cruelty became respectable once it was properly filed. You could be flogged for insolence, for losing a tool, for being caught with stolen food, or simply because an overseer decided you needed reminding of your place. What made it all the more chilling was the deliberate spectacle of it. These punishments were carried out in front of the assembled convicts on purpose, a piece of grim theatre meant to terrify everyone watching into compliance. You were forced to stand and witness it, to hear the count, to see the consequences laid bare, and to understand without a single word being spoken that this could just as easily be you tomorrow. The fear it planted did far more work than the whip itself ever could, and there was no escape valve, no appeal, no kind soul in a wig who might overturn the sentence. The men who ordered the floggings were frequently the same men profiting from your labour, which meant the line between justice and convenience had quietly disappeared. A master who wanted a troublesome worker broken in spirit could arrange it. A magistrate in a foul mood could double a sentence on a whim. The power was total, the oversight was non-existent, and the only real check on cruelty was whatever conscience the man holding the authority happened to possess, which on the worst days was none at all. Some men were flogged so many times over their sentences that their backs became a permanent map of scars, hardened and ridged. A body turned into a record of every petty offence and every bad day. They wore those marks for the rest of their lives, long after they were free, a reminder stitched into the skin that the colony never really stopped collecting its debts. It was a system built on fear, and fear the authorities believed was cheaper and more reliable than fairness. But fear is an expensive currency in the long run, and the colony had already discovered a far more popular one. It was not coin, and it was certainly not justice. It was bottled, it was potent, and it ran the entire settlement from the inside out. Here's a fun economic lesson they never taught you back home. In early colonial Australia, the most trusted currency was not gold, not silver, and not the official coins that nobody seemed to actually have. It was rum. Workers were paid in it. debts were settled with it, and entire deals collapsed or succeeded based on how much of it changed hands. Imagine trying to run a town where the standard unit of value is also a substance that makes everyone progressively worse at running a town. The people who controlled the rum supply controlled nearly everything, which meant the colony was effectively built on a foundation of alcohol and very questionable decisions. Spoiler alert, this did not end well. To understand how this happened, you have to understand the colony's hilarious little money problem. There was barely any actual currency in circulation. The official coins that did arrive had a frustrating habit of being spent on imported goods and immediately sailing right back out again, leaving the settlement perpetually short of anything you could jingle in a pocket. Into this vacuum poured rum, and rum had everything a struggling economy could want. It was valuable, it was portable, everyone wanted it, and unlike a promissory note, you could not eat your feelings with a promissory note, so rum became the grease in every wheel. Need a fence built? Pay in rum. Want a man to work an extra day? Rum. Settling a debt, sealing a bargain, bribing an official, hiring help, buying livestock, rum, 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 and a little more rum for luck. Wages were frequently handed out in bottles rather than coins, which created the magnificent situation of a workforce that was paid in the exact substance, most likely to prevent it from showing up the next morning. It is the kind of business model that looks bad on paper and looks considerably worse from the bottom of a bottle. Naturally, whoever controlled the supply of rum controlled the colony, and the people best positioned to do that were the officers of the military corps stationed there. They had the connections, the ships, and the nerve to buy up incoming cargoes of liquor and resell them at outrageous markups, cornering the market with the ruthless efficiency of a monopoly that also happened to carry muskets. They grew rich and powerful not by defending the colony, which was supposed to be their actual job, but by quietly becoming its liquor barons. The colony's economy and the colony's army had fused into one deeply conflicted, deeply tipsy institution. The consequences rippled outward in ways both predictable and grim. With rum as money, drunkenness was not a personal failing but practically a financial activity. People drank away their wages because their wages were already drink. Productivity suffered, fights multiplied, and a haze of intoxication settled over a settlement that frankly needed all the clear heads it could get. Trying to build a functioning society on a currency that actively impairs judgment is a bit like trying to put out a fire using a substance that is also extremely flammable. And here is the truly absurd heart of it. The colony was supposed to be a place of punishment and reform, a stern correction for people who had broken the law. Instead, it had reorganized its entire economy around the bulk distribution of alcohol, with the law keepers themselves running the racket. The criminals were being punished by a system that was, in its own way, far more crooked than they had ever been. A power structure built on liquor and self-interest is not a stable thing. It works only so long as everyone agrees to look the other way. Sooner or later, someone with actual authority was going to arrive, take one look at this drunken little empire, and decide to shut it down. And when that someone finally tried, the colony responded not with reform, but with the only armed uprising in the nation's history. And now for the only military coup in your nation's history launched more or less over booze. By 1808, the tension between the colony's powerful rum traders and a governor determined to shut them down had reached a breaking point. That governor was William Bligh, a man already famous for inspiring one mutiny at sea and apparently keen to collect the full set. When he tried to crack down on the rum trade, the local military corps simply marched on his residence and arrested him. There was no foreign enemy, no grand cause, just a group of officers deciding the governor was bad for business and removing him like a manager nobody liked. The colony, for a while, was run by the very people it should have been guarding against. You have to appreciate the cosmic comedy of William Bligh's life. This was the same man who, years earlier, had commanded a ship whose crew became so fed up with him that they rose up, seized the vessel, and set him adrift in a small open boat in the middle of the ocean. Most people, having survived one mutiny, would spend the rest of their days being exceptionally agreeable. Bligh instead accepted a job governing a colony that was essentially one enormous powder keg of resentful soldiers and bootleg liquor, then proceeded to start lighting matches. To be fair to him, his actual goal was reasonable. He had been sent to clean up the colony, rein in the corrupt officers, and break the stranglehold the rum trade had on everything. These were good intentions. The problem was that Bligh pursued them with all the gentle diplomacy of a charging bull, antagonizing the very powerful, very armed men whose fortunes depended on the chaos he was trying to end. He made enemies quickly and thoroughly, and in a small isolated colony, making enemies of the people holding the guns is a strategy with a very poor survival rate. The breaking point came when Bligh clashed with one of the colony's most influential and ambitious figures, a man deeply entangled in its trade and land dealings. The dispute escalated into a legal and political standoff, and the officers of the corps, sensing both threat and opportunity, decided they had endured quite enough governing for one lifetime. On a summer evening, the soldiers formed up, marched through the streets with their band playing, and descended on Government House to arrest the king's appointed representative. The image that survives from that night is almost too perfect. According to the story that spread afterward, the soldiers searched the residence and supposedly discovered Bligh hiding, an image his enemies gleefully promoted to paint him as a coward. Whether it was true or pure propaganda hardly mattered. The point had been made. The governor was under arrest, the corps was in charge, and the colony had just experienced the only successful armed takeover of a government in its entire history, conducted not over liberty or justice or grand principle, but over who got to control the booze. What followed was a strange lawless interlude in which the rebel officers ran the colony to suit themselves, handing out land and favours while the deposed governor sat under guard, fuming. It took a very long time for word to crawl back to Britain, and for Britain to crawl back with a response. When the dust finally settled, the corps was eventually disbanded and order was restored, though the man at the centre of it all escaped serious consequences with the practised ease of someone who had done this kind of thing before. The whole affair laid bare an uncomfortable truth about the colony. The people entrusted with maintaining order were perfectly willing to overthrow it the moment it threatened their profits. Which raises a rather pointed question. If the soldiers were this brazen, exactly what kind of men were running things behind the scenes? Here's the uncomfortable twist of colonial life. As a convict, you might assume the people running the place are upstanding pillars of order. They're not. The local military corps, often nicknamed for their monopoly on rum, were less a force for law and more a cartel with uniforms. They controlled trade, land and liquor, and they used their power to enrich themselves while the colony scraped by. Corruption wasn't a scandal here, it was the operating system. So while you're being flogged for stealing bread, the men holding the whip are quietly running schemes that would make a modern fraudster blush. In this colony, the difference between a criminal and an official was mostly just the quality of the coat. The corps had been raised specifically to guard the colony, a job that sounds noble until you realise there was very little to guard it from, and an enormous amount to exploit. With no real enemy to fight and no real oversight to fear, the officers turned their attention to the far more lucrative business of running everything. They used their positions to grab the best land, secure the most convict labour to work it, and lock down the trade in essential goods, all while drawing a salary for the privilege. It was less a military posting and more a license to print money, payable in rum and acreage. Land was the great prize, and the officers helped themselves with breathtaking confidence. The most fertile plots, the most promising holdings, the choicest stretches of the colony somehow always ended up in the hands of the men with the swords and the connections. They then stocked these estates with assigned convicts, meaning the government handed them free labour to build private fortunes. You, sweating in the field, were quite literally the unpaid foundation of someone else's mansion, and that someone was supposedly your moral superior. The genius of the operation was how seamlessly it blended authority with self-interest. The same officers who set prices also enforced them. The same men who controlled the courts also controlled the trade those courts were meant to regulate. If a rival tried to break into the rum business or undercut their land grabs, there were quiet, official ways to make that person's life very difficult. Power, money, and law had all collapsed into the same small group of men, and that group had no intention of sharing. Successive governors arrived from Britain genuinely believing they could fix this, and one by one the colony chewed them up. Some tried to challenge the officers and found themselves isolated, undermined, and outmaneuvered at every turn. The Corps had been entrenched for years, knew every lever of local power, and could simply outlast any reformer foolish enough to take them on directly. The most famous attempt to break them, as we have seen, ended with the governor himself under arrest. The lesson was not lost on anyone. In this colony, the convicts wore chains, but the real outlaws wore epaulettes, and the deepest irony of the whole arrangement was the original premise of the place. Australia had been founded as a destination for criminals, a stern corrective for people who could not respect the law. Yet the people sent to administer that correction had built one of the most flagrant, well-organised criminal enterprises in the empire, hiding in plain sight behind uniforms and titles. The pickpockets and bread thieves at the bottom had nothing on the gentlemen at the top. Faced with the society this rigged, where the powerful preyed on the weak, and the law existed mainly to protect the powerful, some convicts came to a stark conclusion. If the system itself was lawless, why play by its rules at all? Far better, they decided, to take their chances in the one place the officers and their corruption could not easily follow. So they fled into the wild interior, and there they became something the colony had not quite bargained for. Some convicts looked at this whole situation, did a quick risk assessment, and decided the smartest move was to simply run away into the wilderness. These were the bushrangers, escaped prisoners who took their chances in the vast unmapped interior rather than serve out their sentences. Out in the bush they survived by robbery, raiding farms and travellers, becoming the colony's homegrown outlaws. Some were desperate, some were ruthless, and a few became local legends, half feared and half admired by the very people they terrorized. The authorities hated them, the settlers feared them, and the bush itself, full of heat, hunger, and things that bite, did much of the work of finishing them off. Freedom out here came with an extremely short warranty. The temptation to run was understandable. When your daily life consists of forced labour, the threat of the lash, and a future that stretches out in years of misery, the idea of simply walking off into the trees starts to look dangerously appealing. The colony's borders were not walls and gates, but endless wilderness, and the wilderness, in theory, was open to anyone brave or foolish enough to disappear into it. The men who did were known by various names, but bushrangers is the one that stuck, and the bush was both their kingdom and their executioner. The reality of life on the run was considerably grimmer than the daydream that inspired it. The interior was unforgiving in every direction. The heat was punishing, water was scarce and unpredictable, and food did not simply present itself to a man who had spent his life in city streets. Many bolters, as the early escapees were called, staggered into the bush with no skills, no supplies, and no plan beyond a way, and the land disposed of them quietly. Starvation, thirst, and exposure claimed far more would be outlaws than any soldier ever did. Those who survived did so by becoming predators. With no honest way to feed themselves and no intention of going back, bushrangers turned to robbery, ambushing travellers on lonely roads, raiding isolated farms and stealing the supplies, weapons and horses they needed to keep going. Some were merely desperate men doing desperate things to stay alive. Others discovered a taste for the work and grew genuinely dangerous, terrorizing the scattered settlements that had no way to defend themselves and no police force worth the name to call upon. Here the colony's lawlessness folded back on itself in a satisfying loop. The same lack of order that let corrupt officers run wild also meant there was almost nothing standing between a bushranger and his next victim. The territory was too vast, the population too thin, and the authorities too few and too distracted to mount any serious patrol. A bushranger who knew the land could vanish into it after a raid and simply wait, while the handful of soldiers sent to find him blundered around in country that all looked the same and offered no clues. It is little wonder that some bushrangers became folk legends. To ordinary settlers and convicts crushed under a corrupt and brutal system, an outlaw who robbed the wealthy and defied the hated authorities could look less like a villain and more like a grim sort of hero, even as that same outlaw might rob them next. They occupied a strange place in the colonial imagination, feared and admired in roughly equal measure, their exploits passed along and exaggerated until the men themselves disappeared into myth. But myth does not feed you, and the bush does not forgive. Most bushrangers met an early and unglamorous end, run down by soldiers, betrayed by an informer, or simply worn out by a life with no rest and no future. Freedom in the wild turned out to be its own kind of sentence, served in hunger and fear under an enormous indifferent sky. And for those who stayed within the colony's reach, the question of where exactly a person was meant to live was almost as bleak, because the colony's idea of shelter was a subject all its own. After a long day of forced labour, you'll want to retreat to the comfort of your home, a phrase we're using very loosely. Housing in the early colony is a generous word for a hut slapped together from bark, branches, and whatever ambition the builder had left at the end of the day. The walls keep out roughly half the weather. The floor is dirt, the roof leaks with great enthusiasm, and the whole structure has the architectural confidence of a house of cards in a light breeze. There's no insulation against the brutal summer heat or the surprisingly cold nights, and privacy is a concept that hasn't arrived in the colony yet. You don't so much live here as agree to be stored here until morning. The construction methods would give a modern builder a quiet, nervous breakdown. The most common dwellings were thrown together using whatever the land provided, with frames of rough-cut saplings, walls of bark stripped from trees or of mud packed between woven sticks, and roofs of more bark or bundled grass laid on top and hoped for the best. There were no proper foundations, no measured plans, and certainly no inspector coming to check the work. A hut was finished when it was standing, and it was considered a success if it kept standing through the next storm. Comfort, needless to say, was not on the menu. In summer, the thin walls and low roof turned the interior into a stifling box, trapping the heat until lying inside felt like being slowly baked. In winter, those same flimsy walls did almost nothing to hold warmth, and the cold seeped in through every gap, of which there were many. Rain found its way through the roof with depressing reliability, turning the dirt floor to mud and soaking whatever meagre possessions you had managed to accumulate. You learned to position yourself in the one corner that leaked the least, and to consider that a luxury. Then there were the uninvited guests, which is to say all of them. Insects treated your home as a public thoroughfare. Mosquitoes whined in your ears through the night. Flies arrived in clouds with the heat, and a charming assortment of crawling things made themselves comfortable in the bark and the thatch. Snakes and spiders, the kind this continent produces with alarming creativity, saw no meaningful difference between the bush outside and the slightly more bush-like interior of your hut. Sharing your sleeping space with the local wildlife was not a misfortune. It was simply the arrangement. Privacy, that quiet modern luxury, did not exist in any recognizable form. Convicts were often crammed together in shared quarters or government barracks, packed in close with strangers, snorers, and the constant low hum of too many people in too small a space. Even those lucky enough to have their own hut found that one room of bark and mud offered no escape from anyone or anything. The idea of a quiet moment to yourself was as foreign to colonial life as a comfortable mattress, and roughly as available. And yet, grim as it was, this rough shelter mattered enormously. In a place where the heat could kill, the cold could sicken, and the night belonged to creatures with too many legs, even a leaky bark hut was a fragile line of defense against a world that seemed designed to wear you down. It was not a home in any sentimental sense. It was a small, stubborn assertion that you intended to survive another day, built from the only materials a punished, penniless person could reach. So you crawl into your magnificent estate of sticks and dirt, listen to the roof drip and the bush rustle, with things you would rather not identify, and try to rest. You will need it, because surviving the colony took more than a roof over your head. It took fuel for the body, and the colony's idea of a decent meal was, if anything, even more alarming than its idea of a decent house. Let's talk about food, because the colony certainly didn't think about it enough before everyone arrived. Your rations are a thrilling rotation of salted meat, hard biscuit and flour, all of it shipped from very far away and aging badly the entire trip. The salted meat is so heavily preserved it could probably outlive you. The biscuit, often called hardtack, is less a food and more a building material, frequently home to weevils that you eventually stop bothering to remove. Fresh vegetables are a rumour, fruit is a fantasy, and in the lean early years the colony came genuinely close to starvation more than once. You don't eat to enjoy a meal here, you eat to postpone the alternative. Let's begin with the star of the show, the salted meat, which arrives packed in barrels of brine after a journey of several months in the hold of a ship. By the time it reaches your plate, it has the texture of a saddle and the flavour of the ocean it crossed. You soak it, you boil it, you beat it into something chewable, and still it fights you on the way down. The salt that keeps it from rotting also makes it punishingly dry, so every bite leaves you thirstier than the last. It is sustenance in the most technical sense, a substance your body grudgingly accepts as fuel while filing a strongly worded objection. the biscuit deserves its own moment of respect, mostly the kind of respect you give to a brick. Hardtack was baked to survive long voyages, which means it was baked to survive everything, including your teeth. Veterans of the colony learned to soak it first, or crumble it into liquid, because biting it directly was a gamble your molars could lose. And then there were the weevils, the small uninvited tenants that infested the biscuit during its long damp travels. You could pick them out, or you could accept that protein is protein and chew with your eyes politely closed. Most people in time chose the second option. Bread, when there was flour to make it, came in the form of damper, a rough loaf of flour, water, and a pinch of salt baked in the ashes of a fire. It was heavy, dense, and gloriously plain, but it was warm and it was filling, which in this place made it something close to a delicacy. Wash it down with strong tea, the colony's other great comfort, and you had a meal that asked nothing of you but the willingness to eat it. Excitement was not the goal. Survival was. What you will notice gnawing through all of this is the near total absence of anything green or fresh. Fruit and vegetables spoiled long before they could be shipped, and the colony's own attempts at growing them were undermined by stubborn soil and an unfamiliar climate. The result was a diet that left bodies weak and prone to scurvy, that miserable affliction of the deprived where gums bleed, old wounds reopen, and the body slowly comes apart for want of something as simple as a piece of fresh fruit. The cure was known, the supply was not. In the worst stretches, even these grim rations grew scarce. When supply ships were late or lost, the entire colony tightened its belt by force, with rations cut and then cut again, and the spectre of genuine famine looming over everyone. People grew gaunt, work slowed, and the cheerful little settlement revealed itself for what it really was, a community always one delayed ship away from disaster. Eventually, as farms took root and the colony learned to feed itself, the menu improved. But for a long stretch, eating in colonial Australia was a daily act of grim determination. And a body fed this poorly, worked this hard, and housed this badly was a body in constant danger, which made the colony's approach to medicine a subject worth a very nervous look. Feeling unwell? In colonial Australia, that's a deeply unfortunate situation to be in. Medical care, where it exists at all, is a blend of guesswork, optimism, and remedies that often did more harm than the illness. The surgeons brought over were stretched impossibly thin, supplies were limited, and the prevailing medical wisdom of the era still leaned heavily on bleeding patients and hoping for the best. Dysentery, scurvy, fevers, and infection moved through the colony freely, and a minor wound could turn deadly with terrifying speed. There were no antibiotics, no real understanding of how disease spread, and very little anyone could do once it took hold. Out here, your best healthcare strategy was simply not getting sick in the first place. The medical thinking of the age was, to put it kindly, not yet ready for prime time. Doctors of the period still believed that many illnesses came from bad air or an imbalance of fluids within the body, which led to treatments that range from useless to actively dangerous. Bleeding a patient, deliberately draining their blood to restore some imagined balance, was a respected remedy, which meant that arriving sick and weak might earn you the privilege of being made even weaker on purpose. The idea that tiny invisible organisms caused disease was still decades away, so the colony's healers were essentially fighting an enemy they could not see, with weapons that frequently missed. The colony's surgeons, to their credit, were often dedicated men doing their best in impossible conditions. The trouble was that there were far too few of them, and far too many patients, scattered across a settlement with little equipment and dwindling supplies of medicine. A single surgeon might be responsible for hundreds of convicts, soldiers and settlers, and when an outbreak swept through, he could do little more than triage the misery and watch. Skill mattered less than arithmetic, and the arithmetic was always against him. The diseases themselves were relentless. Dysentery thrived in the cramped, filthy living conditions, spreading through contaminated water and food, and laying people low by the dozens. Fevers of various kinds came and went with the seasons. Scurvy gnawed at anyone deprived of fresh food, which was nearly everyone. And then there was the ordinary everyday danger of injury, because in a world without antibiotics, a small cut from a tool or a thorn could fester, turn septic, and kill a healthy adult within days. There was no reliable way to stop an infection once it started. You cleaned the wound, you prayed, and you waited to see which way it would go. Childbirth, too, carried enormous risk, as it did everywhere in that era. But the colony's isolation and shortage of care sharpened the danger. There was little to be done for serious complications, and both mothers and infants died at rates that would horrify a modern hospital. Bringing new life into the colony was an act of hope shadowed by very real peril. A hospital of sorts was eventually built, though even that came wrapped in the colony's signature corruption, funded through a deal that handed its builders a lucrative monopoly on, of all things, rum. So the very institution meant to heal the colony was paid for by the substance doing a fair amount of the damage. It is the kind of detail that would seem too on the nose if it were not simply true. In the end, surviving illness here owed less to medicine and more to luck, a strong constitution, and the sheer stubborn refusal of the body to quit. The colony could not cure you. It could only offer you a bed and a bit of company while your odds played out. And those odds, harsh as they were, fell hardest on certain people whose entire experience of the colony was shaped by who they were, beginning with the women. The colony was not built by men alone, though the men in charge often acted like it should have been. Thousands of women were transported too, sentenced for the same petty crimes, and shipped to a place that had decided in advance exactly what it wanted from them. Many were placed in institutions known as female factories, part workhouse, part prison, part labour pool, where they spun wool, did laundry, and waited to be assigned to households or husbands. They had little say in their own futures and faced judgment from a society that blamed them for circumstances it had created. Yet they endured, they built families, and they quietly became the backbone of a colony that rarely thanked them for it. The women who arrived on the convict ships had committed the same forgettable crimes as the men, the petty thefts and minor offences born of poverty and desperation. But they were met with a different and harsher set of expectations the moment they stepped ashore. A colony heavy with men and short on what the authorities considered respectable society viewed female convicts through a narrow and unforgiving lens, judging their worth less by their labour and more by their reputation, their marriageability, and their usefulness in building families. A woman's past was held against her with a severity the men were largely spared. The female factories were the institutions built to manage all of this, and they were strange, contradictory places. They served at once as places of work, where women spun, wove and washed for the colony, as places of punishment for those who broke the rules, and as holding centres where newly arrived women waited to be assigned to settlers or matched with husbands. Conditions were often crowded and grim, the labour monotonous, and the rules strict, with the constant judgment of overseers hanging over everything. A woman might pass through one of these factories several times in her colonial life, in and out as her circumstances shifted. Assignment and marriage were the main routes out, and both were gambles. A woman assigned to a household might find steady work and decent treatment, or she might find herself isolated, overworked, and vulnerable with no one to appeal to. Marriage offered a measure of security and standing, but it too was often less a matter of affection than of survival, in a place where a woman alone had few protections. Choices were limited, and the power to make them rarely rested entirely in a woman's own hands. Through all of it, the women carried an extraordinary double burden. They performed the relentless labour the colony demanded, then bore and raised the children who had become the colony's first native-born generation, all while enduring a steady stream of contempt from those who looked down on them for being convicts and for being women in a place suspicious of both. The families they built, the homes they held together, and the communities they slowly stitched into existence were the quiet foundation on which the entire settlement's future rested. History for a long time paid them little mind, remembering the governors and the officers and the bushrangers, while the women who actually held the place together faded into the margins. But the colony as it grew, as it steadied, as it became a society rather than a prison camp, owed an enormous and largely unacknowledged debt to them. Their resilience was not loud, and it was not celebrated, but it was absolutely essential. There is one more thing that must be said before we go on, and it cannot be said lightly. The colony liked to tell itself a comforting story, that it had arrived in an empty and waiting land, free for the taking. That story was not true, and before we continue, it is right to stop and sit with the truth it was built to hide. Before we go any further, it is worth stopping to remember something the colony tried very hard to ignore. You were not arriving in an empty land. For tens of thousands of years before any ship appeared on the horizon, this continent was home to hundreds of Aboriginal nations, each with its own language, law, culture, and a deep and lasting connection to the country you're now standing on. The arrival of the colony brought disease, dispossession, and violence that would devastate these communities for generations to come. This part of the story holds no humour, and it deserves none. It is simply the truth that sits beneath everything else you will hear tonight, and it should never be forgotten. Long before any sail was sighted, the peoples of this continent had built ways of living shaped by an intimate knowledge of the land, passed down through countless generations. They held detailed understanding of the seasons, the water, the plants, and the animals, and they cared for the country through practices refined over a span of time so vast it is difficult to truly grasp. There were many distinct nations, many languages, and rich and complex traditions of law, story, ceremony, and kinship. This was not an empty wilderness waiting to be claimed. It was a living, inhabited world, ancient and ordered and whole. The colony's arrival shattered that world with terrible speed. Among the first and most devastating consequences was disease. Illnesses carried by the newcomers, against which the original inhabitants had no immunity, swept through communities with catastrophic force, killing people in numbers that are painful even to contemplate. Whole communities were stricken in a matter of weeks. This early and overwhelming loss of life caused suffering on a scale that words struggle to hold, and it tore at the fabric of societies that had endured for thousands of years. Then came the loss of the land itself. As the colony expanded outward, settlers and their livestock pushed onto country that was not theirs, country that held deep meaning and sustained the people who belonged to it. Access to traditional lands, to water, to sources of food, and to sacred places was cut off or destroyed. The dispossession was not a single event, but a long, grinding process that followed the frontier wherever it advanced, displacing people from places their families have been part of since time beyond memory. Where there was resistance, and there was resistance, there was violence. Across the frontier and across the decades, conflict over land and survival led to bloodshed, and the cost fell most heavily on the Aboriginal peoples defending their homes and their lives. These were not distant abstractions, but real communities, real families, enduring real and profound loss. The harm done in these years left wounds that have been carried across generations and are still felt today. It is important to say plainly that the people of these nations did not simply vanish, as the colony's convenient story sometimes implied. They survived. Despite disease, dispossession and violence, Aboriginal peoples endured, holding on to culture, language and connection to country, through circumstances designed, whether by intent or indifference, to erase them. That endurance, across more than 2 centuries since the colony began, is itself a profound testament to strength. This chapter of the story asks nothing of us tonight except honesty and the willingness to remember. The colony was built on land that was already loved, already known, and already home to others, and the foundations of everything that followed rest on that fact. It is not a comfortable truth, but it is a true one, and a story of this place that left it out would not be worth telling. The wider history of the colony did not pause to reckon with any of this. It rolled onward, restless and hungry, and its next great upheaval was already waiting, hidden quietly in the ground beneath everyone's feet. And then, in 1851, the entire colony lost its collective mind. Gold was discovered, and word spread across the world like fire across dry grass. Almost overnight, the steady trickle of arrivals became a flood. Sailors abandoned their ships in the harbour, workers walked off their jobs mid-sentence, and tens of thousands of hopeful strangers poured in from every corner of the globe, all chasing the same dream of getting impossibly rich. Towns emptied as everyone rushed to the goldfields. The population exploded, the economy convulsed, and a colony that was just starting to find its footing was suddenly trampled by a stampede of dreamers, schemers, and people who had absolutely no idea what they were doing. The discovery itself was almost comically simple. Word got out that gold, actual gold, was lying in the creeks and just beneath the soil in certain regions, free for anyone willing to dig for it. In an age when most people lived their entire lives in grinding poverty with no hope of ever escaping it, this was electrifying news. The promise was irresistible. You did not need education or family connections or a respectable name. You needed a pan, a shovel, a strong back, and the nerve to chase a fortune lying in the dirt. For the first time, getting rich seemed like something that could happen to anyone, including you. The result was one of the largest movements of people the region had ever seen. They came from across the existing colonies, abandoning farms and shops and steady work. They came from across the world, from Britain, Europe, China, and the Americas, packing onto ships bound for the goldfields with their heads full of dreams and their pockets mostly empty. The ports overflowed. Some ships arrived only to be deserted in the harbour, their crews having thrown down their duties the instant they touched land and bolted for the diggings. Why haul cargo for wages when a single lucky strike could set you up for life? The effect on the colony was seismic. The population swelled at a pace no one had planned for and no one could control. Settlements that had been quiet and orderly drained of their workers as men chased the gold, leaving businesses understaffed and ordinary life disrupted. Wages had to climb just to convince anyone to do unglamorous work, because why would a man dig drains for a pittance when the goldfields beckoned? The whole economic order of the colony was thrown into the air, and it came down looking completely different. For a fortunate few, the dream actually came true. There were genuine fortunes pulled from the ground, nuggets and finds that turned penniless arrivals into wealthy men in a single astonishing day. These were the stories that travelled, that drew the next wave of hopefuls, that kept the fever burning hot. Everyone had heard of someone who had struck it rich, and everyone quietly believed they might be next. But for every triumphant strike, there were thousands of disappointments. Most people who flooded the goldfields worked themselves to exhaustion for little or nothing, scraping at the earth day after day while their savings dwindled and their dreams curdled. The gold was real, but it was not endless, and it was certainly not evenly shared. For the majority, the great adventure became a hard, muddy slog, ending in empty pockets, and the long road home or onward to the next rumour. What the gold rush truly created, more than fortunes, was chaos. It threw together a vast, restless, desperate crowd of strangers from every background, all crammed into rough camps, all competing for the same prize, in a place with almost no order to keep them in check. And when you take that many hungry dreamers and remove almost every restraint, things do not stay civilized for very long. If you thought the colony was lawless before, wait until you see the goldfields. Picture a sprawling, muddy sea of tents stretching to the horizon, packed with desperate men, very little law, and an enormous amount of suddenly portable wealth. Claims were jumped, fortunes were stolen, and disputes were often settled with fists, knives, or whoever shouted loudest. The few officials sent to keep order were vastly outnumbered and frequently more interested in collecting fees than enforcing anything. Theft was constant, trust was rare, and the line between striking it rich and being robbed blind was alarmingly thin. The goldfields weren't a town so much as a fever, and everyone there had caught it badly. Picture the scene in all its glory. A landscape churned into mud and pockmarked with holes, dotted as far as the eye can see with canvas tents and rough shelters, the air thick with smoke, noise and the smell of too many unwashed people living too close together. There are no proper streets, no plumbing, no order beyond what the diggers impose on themselves. Men work shoulder to shoulder in the dirt by day and collapse into crowded camps by night, and the whole sprawling settlement pulses with a restless, feverish energy. It is less a town than a vast temporary anthill of human ambition. The central problem of the goldfields was simple. Wealth here was small, portable, and easily hidden, which made it almost perfectly designed to be stolen. A man might spend weeks of brutal labour to gather a pouch of gold, only to have it vanish in the night, lifted by a thief who slipped between the tents. There were no banks to speak of in the early rush, nowhere truly safe to store a fortune, so diggers carried their gold on their bodies or buried it and prayed, sleeping fitfully with one hand on their treasure and one eye open. Disputes over claims were a constant source of conflict, and they could turn ugly fast. Two men might both insist they had the rights to a promising patch of ground, and with no clear authority to settle the matter, and a fortune potentially at stake, the argument frequently moved from words to fists to worse. Claim jumping, the practice of muscling in on ground someone else was working, was a reliable way to start a brawl or end up in a shallow grave. Out here, your right to your own dig was only as strong as your willingness to defend it. The official response to all this was thin to the point of comedy. The authorities did send representatives to the goldfields, but their numbers were laughably small against the heaving mass of humanity they were meant to oversee. Worse, these officials often seemed far more interested in extracting money than in keeping the peace. Their primary occupation, as the diggers saw it, was hunting down anyone who had not paid for the license required to mine, a fee that fell hardest on the poorest and produced enormous resentment. Order was not really the goal, revenue was. This is what truly tipped the goldfields toward the feral. You had an enormous, transient population of strangers, no shared community to enforce norms, valuable wealth flowing through dirty hands, and an authority that was both too weak to protect people and too eager to fleece them. Trust evaporated. Every man watched his own back and suspected his neighbour. Violence simmered constantly beneath the surface, ready to erupt over a stolen claim, a rigged game, or a heavy-handed license check gone wrong. A pressure like that does not build forever without finding release. When you push a crowd of armed, exhausted, deeply aggrieved men hard enough and tax them and harass them while you do it, you should not be surprised when they finally decide they have had enough. And on one patch of the Victorian diggings, that is exactly what happened. The chaos of the goldfields eventually boiled over into something far more serious. The miners, furious at the heavy licensing fees, the corrupt officials, and the brutal way the rules were enforced finally reached their limit. In 1854, near Ballarat, a group of them built a rough wooden barricade, raised their own flag, and made a stand against the colonial authorities. It was called the Eureka Stockade, and it ended in a short, bloody clash that the miners lost in a matter of minutes. But losing the battle didn't mean losing the argument. The rebellion struck such a nerve that it forced real reforms, and it became a powerful symbol of ordinary people refusing to be pushed any further. The grievances behind it had been festering for a long time. At the heart of the anger was the mining license, a fee every digger was required to pay simply for the right to search for gold, whether or not they ever found any. For men barely scraping by, the cost was a constant burden, and the way it was enforced made it unbearable. The license hunts, in which officials and police swept through the diggings demanding to see proof of payment, were frequently aggressive and humiliating, and miners caught without a current license faced fines or worse. To the diggers it felt less like law and more like organised harassment of the poor. Layered on top of this was a deeper frustration. The miners had no real political voice, no say in the laws that governed and taxed them, and little faith that the corrupt and high-handed authorities would ever treat them fairly. When a flashpoint involving the death of a miner and a deeply unpopular legal outcome inflamed the diggings, the simmering resentment finally caught fire. The miners began to organise to hold mass meetings and to demand change, and when their demands were brushed aside, some of them resolved to resist. They gathered at Ballarat, built a rough barricade of timber and overturned carts, and gathered behind it in defiance of the government. Above them they raised a flag of their own design, a field of blue bearing the white stars of the Southern Cross, a banner that would long outlive the stockade itself. Inside, the men swore an oath to stand by one another and defend their rights and liberties. It was a genuine, if desperate, act of rebellion, a declaration that they would no longer be governed by force and contempt alone. The authorities responded the way authorities tend to respond to barricades. In the pre-dawn dark, soldiers and police stormed the stockade in a sudden assault. The defenders, fewer in number and caught at a low moment, were overwhelmed almost immediately. The fighting was fierce but desperately short, a matter of minutes, and when it was over, the stockade was taken. Dozens lay dead or wounded, most of them miners, and the survivors were scattered or arrested. As a military engagement, it was a crushing and lopsided defeat, and yet it did not feel like a defeat for long. News of the assault, of armed soldiers gunning down diggers behind a homemade barricade, sent a shock of sympathy and outrage across the colony. Public opinion swung sharply behind the miners. When the captured rebels were brought to trial, juries refused to convict them, an unmistakable verdict on where the people's sympathies lay. The authorities, suddenly aware of how badly they had misjudged the public mood, were forced to reconsider. In the aftermath came real change. The hated license was scrapped and replaced with a fairer system, and steps were taken to give miners a genuine political voice. A reckless, doomed little stand behind a wooden wall had achieved what years of grievance had not. It became a lasting symbol of ordinary people demanding to be treated as more than a source of revenue. The miners had lost the fight and won the cause, which is more than most rebellions can claim. Given everything we've covered, it should surprise no one that the colony's favourite hobby was drinking, aggressively and constantly. Rum had set the tone early, and the habit only deepened from there. On the goldfields and in the towns, illegal liquor sellers known as sly grog merchants did a roaring trade, dodging licenses and selling drink of dubious origin and even more dubious safety. The grog shanties that sprang up were rough, crowded, and frequently the starting point for fights, robberies, and decisions that seemed brilliant at the time. Alcohol was both the colony's comfort and its curse, dulling the misery while reliably making everything else considerably worse. The thirst made a certain grim sense. Life in the colony, and especially on the goldfields, was hard, monotonous, and often miserable, full of back-breaking labour, crushed hopes, and very little to look forward to. Drink offered a cheap and reliable escape, a few hours of warmth and forgetfulness at the bottom of a cup. When your days are spent up to your knees in mud chasing a fortune that refuses to appear, the appeal of drinking yourself into a better mood becomes very easy to understand. The whole colony, it sometimes seemed, was self-medicating. The authorities naturally tried to control the trade through licenses, the same tool they used for everything else, and just as naturally an enormous illegal market sprang up to dodge those controls entirely. Sly grog selling, the unlicensed sale of liquor, became a thriving underground business, especially on the goldfields where official licenses were scarce and demand was bottomless. Anyone with a tent, a barrel, and a flexible attitude toward the law could set up shop and start pouring. The profits were excellent, and the risk of getting caught was modest in a place the authorities could barely police. The drink itself was a gamble in its own right. Properly made spirits were expensive and hard to come by, so sly grog sellers frequently peddled crude, improvised concoctions of questionable origin and alarming potency. These rough brews could be adulterated with all manner of things to stretch the supply or fake the strength, and drinking them was a roll of the dice with your health. You ordered a cup, you swallowed it down, and you found out afterward whether it merely got you drunk or also tried to blind you. In the pursuit of oblivion, the diggers were not picky. The grog shanties where all this happened were rough places indeed, crude shelters of canvas and timber, packed with drinkers blowing off the pressures of a brutal life. They were loud, crowded, and volatile, and they had a way of turning a hard day worse. Mix exhausted, frustrated, armed men with cheap liquor and a crowded tent, and fights were not a possibility but a near certainty. Brawls broke out over nothing. Robberies flourished, since a drunk man with gold in his pocket was the easiest mark imaginable. Many a digger drank away in a single riotous night the wealth he had spent weeks pulling from the ground. The cost of all this was steep and constant. Drunkenness fueled the colony's violence, emptied its workers' pockets, and wore down bodies already pushed to their limits. It was woven so deeply into colonial life that it was practically a feature rather than a flaw, a great communal vice that everyone deplored and almost everyone shared. The comfort it offered was real, but it was borrowed against the future, and the interest was paid in fights, ruin, and ruined health. All of which raises a rather obvious question about a place this drunk, this violent, and this awash in stolen gold. With brawls in every shanty and theft around every corner, where exactly were the forces of law and order in all of this? The answer, it turns out, is the most lawless detail of the whole Lawless story. Let's address the elephant in the colony, the almost total absence of anything resembling effective law enforcement. In the early years, policing was a chaotic afterthought, sometimes handed to convicts themselves, who policed other convicts with all the impartiality you'd expect. The territory was vast, the population was scattered, and the few officials available were overwhelmed, underpaid, and often crooked. Crimes routinely went unsolved or simply unnoticed. If something was stolen from you, your options were limited to finding it yourself or quietly accepting the loss. The comforting modern idea that someone will come if you call for help did not exist here. In this colony, you were very much your own security system. Consider the brilliance of the early arrangement. With no proper police force on hand, the colony hit upon the inspired solution of recruiting constables from among the convicts themselves. So the men tasked with catching criminals were, quite often, criminals. The results were about what you would expect. These convict constables were poorly motivated, easily bribed, and frequently more interested in settling personal scores or lining their own pockets than in upholding any kind of justice. Asking a convict to police his fellow convicts impartially was like asking a fox to run security for the henhouse, and the foxes performed accordingly. Even setting aside the questionable quality of the lawkeepers, there was the small matter of geography. The colony sprawled across an immense and largely untamed landscape, with settlements scattered thinly across enormous distances and vast stretches of wilderness in between. Even a competent, honest, well-equipped force would have struggled to maintain order across so much ground, and the colony's force was none of those things. A criminal could commit a crime in one place and simply move on, swallowed up by the sheer scale of the country before anyone could organize a pursuit. The numbers made a mockery of the whole enterprise. There were always far too few officials to oversee far too many people across far too much territory. When the gold rush sent the population exploding, the gap became absurd, with a handful of overwhelmed officers responsible for teeming goldfields full of restless strangers. The math simply did not work. The authorities could make a show of enforcement here and there, conduct a license hunt, make an example of someone, but genuine, consistent law and order across the colony was beyond their reach. So the practical reality of life was that most crime went unanswered. A theft was unlikely to be investigated, let alone solved. A robbery on a lonely road was a matter between you and the robber, with no cavalry coming over the hill. If your property vanished, you could try to track it down yourself, lean on whatever rough community justice the locals improvised, or simply accept the loss and move on. The notion that you could summon help and expect it to arrive was a luxury of a more orderly world, and this was not that world. This vacuum shaped everything about how people lived. Men went armed. They guarded their own gold, their own homes, their own families, because no one else was going to do it for them. Communities where they were tight enough took matters into their own hands, dispensing rough and ready justice when the official kind failed to appear, which was nearly always. Self-reliance was not a virtue here so much as a survival requirement, and trust was a currency spent very carefully. In a place this large, this lawless, and this thinly watched, it is little wonder that the more desperate among the convicts kept dreaming of slipping away from the whole arrangement entirely. After all, if no one could reliably catch a thief, surely no one could catch a man making a run for freedom. As it happens, the colony did not need to catch them. The land took care of that all on its own. Naturally, some convicts dreamed of escape, and some of those dreams were spectacularly misinformed. A surprising number believed that if they simply walked far enough north, they could reach China, freedom, and a better life on foot. They could not. What actually waited for them was a brutal, unforgiving interior of heat, drought, and starvation, with no maps, no supplies, and no real idea where they were going. Most escape attempts ended in recapture, collapse, or worse, swallowed up by a landscape that did not care about anyone's plans. The colony barely needed walls to hold its prisoners. The sheer scale and savagery of the surrounding wilderness did most of the work all by itself. The China belief is the detail that captures the whole hopeless enterprise. Some convicts, with little understanding of geography and even less reliable information, became convinced that China lay somewhere to the north, reachable overland by anyone willing to walk far enough. It was a fantasy built on rumour and desperation, the kind of story that spreads through a prison population precisely because people need so badly to believe it. In their minds, freedom was simply a long hike away, through the bush, over the horizon, to a land where no one would chain them. The reality was a continent of staggering size, whose interior would have killed them long before any border, real or imagined, came into view. This was the genius, if you can call it that, of the colony's natural defences. There were no great walls or fences holding the convicts in place. There did not need to be. The settlement was ringed by a wilderness so vast, so harsh, and so utterly unforgiving that it functioned as a prison wall far more effective than anything built by human hands. To escape the colony was not to slip past a guard. It was to walk out into a country that offered almost nothing to a person who did not know how to live in it, and that country was patient. The practical realities crushed most attempts quickly. A convict who fled into the bush carried whatever meagre supplies he could steal or scrounge, which was never enough. Once those ran out, he faced a landscape that did not yield food easily to the uninitiated, where water could be scarce and unpredictable, and where the heat alone could wear a man down to nothing. There were no signposts, no settlements to resupply at, no friendly faces, just an endless, indifferent expanse in which a city-bred thief had no more idea of how to survive than he did of how to fly. The endings were predictable and grim. Many escapees, hungry and lost, simply turned back or were recaptured, dragging themselves into custody half-starved, almost relieved to be caught. Others fared far worse, perishing in the wilderness, undone by thirst, hunger, and exposure, their bones left somewhere in country no one would search. The escape that was meant to be a path to freedom became, for too many, a slow and lonely death far from anyone who might have helped. A grim few, the bolters who became bushrangers, managed to survive out there by turning to robbery and violence, but theirs was hardly the peaceful liberty the dreamers imagined. For most, the lesson written across these doomed attempts was brutally clear. The colony did not have to chase you very hard, because the moment you ran, you were stepping into the custody of the land itself, and the land did not negotiate. and so the would-be escapee learned the cruelest truth of his imprisonment. The walls were everywhere and nowhere, made not of stone but of distance and drought and heat. There was in the end almost no way out. But if a man truly pushed his luck, defied the authorities one time too many, or proved himself too dangerous and too rebellious even for this place, the colony did have one more answer ready. It had a destination reserved for its worst, a place designed to extinguish hope entirely, and to that grim island we turn next. If you somehow thought ordinary convict life was the worst this system had to offer, the colony had a special destination reserved for you. Norfolk Island was the place they sent the prisoners deemed too troublesome even for Australia, a remote speck in the ocean designed to break the spirit completely. The conditions there were deliberately, almost theatrically harsh, with savage punishments, crushing labour, and a level of cruelty intended to make the mainland look like a holiday. It earned a reputation so grim that some prisoners reportedly preferred death to being sent there. It was punishment turned into an art form, the colony's way of reminding everyone that things could always get worse. Start with the geography, because the geography was the whole point. Norfolk Island sat alone in the vast emptiness of the ocean, a tiny dot of land roughly 1,000 miles from the mainland, surrounded on every side by water with no friendly shore in reach. There was no walking away from this place, no slipping into the bush, no horizon to run toward. The sea itself was the wall, and it was a wall 1,000 miles thick. To be sent here was to be removed not just from freedom, but from the very possibility of it, dropped into isolation so complete that hope had nowhere to go. The island was used as a place of secondary punishment, reserved for convicts who had already been transported and then committed further offences, the repeat offenders and the rebellious, the men the system had given up on reforming and decided instead to crush. The official intention was chillingly explicit. Norfolk Island was meant to be the most severe punishment short of execution itself, a deliberate exercise in breaking men down. This was not negligence or accidental cruelty. It was cruelty by design, engineered and approved. Daily life matched the intention. The labour was relentless and frequently pointless. Heavy work imposed less to accomplish anything than to grind the prisoners down. Discipline was savage, with floggings handed out freely and in enormous numbers for the smallest infractions, the lash falling until backs were ruined. Some commandants ran the place with a brutality that became infamous even by the standards of the age, treating the men less as prisoners to be managed than as enemies to be punished without limit. Food was poor, conditions were degrading, and the entire regime was tuned to extinguish any flicker of dignity or defiance. The psychological weight of it all may have been the heaviest burden of any. To be trapped on a remote island, beyond rescue, beyond appeal, under men who answered to no one and seemed to relish the power, was to live in a state of crushing hopelessness. There was nothing to look forward to and no end in sight, only the next day of labour and the next stroke of the lash. The cruelty was not only physical, it was the slow, deliberate erasure of any reason to keep going. The most haunting measure of how bad it became survives in the accounts of men who, it was said, came to see death as a release. There were grim stories of prisoners so broken by the island that they no longer feared execution but welcomed it, anything to end the ordeal. Whether every such tale was literally true hardly matters. That the island earned such a reputation at all tells you everything about what it was. A place where death could seem a mercy is a place that has abandoned any pretense of justice. Norfolk Island stands as the darkest expression of the colony's capacity for cruelty, the bottom of a system already harsh at every level. But it was not the only such place, nor the only experiment in breaking the human spirit. Across the water, on the island of Tasmania, another infamous prison was perfecting a different and in some ways even more unsettling kind of punishment. Across the water in Tasmania sat another monument to colonial discipline, Port Arthur. Surrounded by water and guarded, it was promoted as a prison from which escape was effectively impossible, a reputation the authorities were happy to encourage. Over time it evolved beyond simple brutality and began experimenting with a colder kind of punishment, one built on isolation and silence rather than the lash. Prisoners could be kept apart, hooded and forbidden to speak, the theory being that crushing the mind was more effective than crushing the body. Whether that was progress or simply a quieter form of cruelty is a question that still lingers. Either way, Port Arthur became one of the most feared names in the entire system. Like Norfolk Island, Port Arthur owed much of its security to nature. It occupied a narrow peninsula connected to the rest of the land by only a thin strip, and that strip was guarded famously by a line of chained dogs stationed across it to catch anyone foolish enough to try to slip past. The cold water surrounding the peninsula did the rest, and the authorities encouraged dark rumours about what lurked in it to discourage swimmers. The message to every prisoner was clear: you're sealed in, watched, and cut off, and the land itself has been turned into your jailer. In its early decades, Port Arthur ran on the familiar colonial currency of hard labour and physical punishment. Convicts toiled in timber and at other gruelling work, and the lash was a constant presence for those who stepped out of line. It was a brutal place by any ordinary measure. But over time, the men who ran it became interested in a newer theory of punishment, one that turned away from the whip and toward the mind, and it is this experiment that gives Port Arthur its peculiar and lingering horror. The idea was that the most effective way to reform, or at least to subdue, a prisoner was not to break his body but to break his sense of self. In a special prison built for the purpose, certain convicts were subjected to a regime of near total isolation and enforced silence. They were kept apart from one another, confined alone, and when moved about they were sometimes hooded so they could not see or be seen, their identities reduced to numbers. Speech was forbidden. The world was stripped down to a cell, silence, and the inside of one's own head, hour after hour, day after day. To the reformers of the era, this was considered a more humane and enlightened approach, a punishment that left no scars on the back. But the human mind is not built for that kind of nothingness. Prolonged isolation and silence, with no human contact and no relief, took a severe toll, and accounts suggest that some men subjected to it suffered profound psychological breakdowns. The absence of the lash did not mean the absence of harm. It simply moved the damage somewhere harder to see, which is a poor definition of mercy. That is the unsettling legacy of Port Arthur. It can be read as a step away from naked brutality and towards something more controlled, or it can be read as cruelty refined and hidden, the same impulse to break a person dressed up in the language of reform. Both readings have truth in them, and the question they raise is genuinely difficult. A wound you cannot see is still a wound, and a prison designed to dismantle the mind is a fearsome thing no matter how quietly it operates. For all their grim machinery, though, the penal settlements were only one face of colonial life. Away from the islands and the silent cells, ordinary people in the towns and on the diggings were busy inventing their own ways to court ruin, and few were as cheerfully self-destructive as the colony's deep and abiding love of a wager. With money scarce, comforts few, and the future uncertain, the colony developed a deep and abiding love of gambling. Chief among the games was Two Up, a simple bet on the toss of two coins that required no skill, only nerve and a willingness to part with your wages. Cards, dice and wagers on absolutely anything filled the rest of the time. Gambling offered a brief, thrilling illusion of control in a place where almost nothing was actually in your control, and for many it became one more way to lose what little they had. Fortunes won on the goldfields were frequently gambled away by morning. In the colony, hope and ruin often sat at the very same table. Two Up was the perfect game for the place, beautiful in its stupidity. The entire affair consisted of tossing two coins into the air and betting on whether they would land as two heads or two tails. That was it. There was no strategy to learn, no skill to hone, nothing to study. You put your money down, the coins went up, and gravity decided your fate. For a population that was largely poor, often uneducated, and desperate for a flutter of excitement, this stripped-down simplicity was the whole appeal. Anyone could play, anyone could win, and anyone, more reliably, could lose. The popularity of the game spoke to something deeper than mere fun. In a colony where men had almost no control over their own lives, where their labour, their freedom and their futures were dictated by others, gambling offered a rare and intoxicating taste of agency. At the toss of a coin, you were the master of your own fate, if only for a few seconds. You could win big, change everything, beat the odds that had beaten you everywhere else. It was a lie, of course, since the coins cared nothing for your hopes, but it was a seductive one, and the colony swallowed it whole. Two Up was far from the only outlet. The colonists wagered on cards, on dice, on races, on fights, on the outcome of more or less anything that could be made uncertain. If two things could be compared and one could win, a colonist would find a way to bet on it. Gambling threaded through the taverns, the grog shanties, and the goldfield camps, a constant background hum of risk and chance. It was entertainment, it was social ritual, and for the unlucky and the addicted, it was a steady drain that swallowed everything they had. The goldfields took this to its natural ruinous extreme. There, gambling and sudden wealth made a volatile pair. A digger might labour for weeks, finally strike a decent find, and walk into a tent flush with gold and confidence, only to lose every speck of it before dawn at the toss of a coin or the turn of a card. The wealth that had seemed like the answer to all his prayers evaporated in a single feverish night, and he woke up exactly as poor as before, plus a hangover and a hard lesson he would probably ignore. Easy come, easy go, and on the diggings it went very easily indeed. There was a grim poetry to it all. The colony was a place built on long odds and desperate hopes, where people had crossed the world or dug through the earth chasing fortunes that mostly never came. Gambling was simply that same gamble distilled into its purest form, the dream of transformation against the near certainty of loss. People kept playing because the alternative, accepting that the odds were against them in everything, was unbearable. Better to roll the dice and believe for one more night that luck might finally break your way. But luck in the colony was not handed out evenly, and neither was respect, because beyond the gambling tables and the goldfields lay a society quietly sorting itself into winners and losers of a different kind. A rigid pecking order that decided whose past would be forgiven and whose would haunt them forever. As the colony grew, a rigid and frankly petty social ladder emerged. At the bottom were the convicts. Above them sat the emancipists, former convicts who had served their time and were trying to build respectable lives. And looming over everyone were the free settlers and officials, some of whom looked down on anyone with a convict past as though stealing a loaf of bread decades ago was a permanent stain on the soul. These divisions sparked endless feuds over land, status, and respect, with the so-called respectable class working hard to keep the formerly convicted in their place. It was a brand new society, built far from home, that somehow managed to recreate snobbery faster than it built proper roads. At the bottom of the ladder naturally were the convicts still serving their sentences, the unfree labourers whose lives belonged to others and whose station was the lowest the colony had to offer. Above them were the emancipists, the men and women who had served out their time or earned their freedom and were now attempting, against considerable resistance, to live as ordinary citizens. Many emancipists worked hard, acquired land, built businesses, and prospered, and on the strength of their own effort they had every reasonable claim to respectability. The trouble was that respectability in this colony was not awarded on merit alone. Above the emancipists, and determined to stay there, sat the free settlers and officials who had come to the colony of their own accord, untainted by any criminal sentence. The most snobbish among them regarded the convict stain as something close to permanent and contagious, a mark that no amount of time, success, or good behaviour could ever fully erase. To this set, a man who had once been transported was forever beneath them, regardless of how wealthy or upstanding he had since become. They guarded their social superiority jealously and looked down their noses at the formerly convicted with an enthusiasm that bordered on a hobby. The result was a society quietly at war with itself over the question of who counted. The free settlers fought to keep the emancipists out of positions of influence and respect, resisting their claims to full standing in colonial life. The emancipists, many of them prosperous and proud, pushed back, insisting that having paid their debt they deserved to be treated as equals. The disputes played out over land, over wealth, over legal rights and social recognition, a constant low-grade feud about status that shaped colonial politics and colonial dinner parties alike. There is a rich irony in all of it that should not be missed. This was a brand new society, established at the far end of the earth, populated in large part by people the old world had cast out for being insufficiently respectable. If anywhere on the planet had a reason to leave the old snobberies behind and build something fresh, it was here. Instead, the colony reproduced the rigid class consciousness of the society that had exiled them with remarkable speed and dedication, drawing fine distinctions of rank among people, most of whom had arrived in chains. Humans, it turns out, will erect a social hierarchy almost anywhere, given half a chance and a spare afternoon. And yet, beneath the snobbery, something genuinely new was taking shape. A generation was being born in the colony itself, children who had never seen Britain, never worn chains, and never much cared who among their elders had. To them, the old distinctions meant less and less. The convict past, so shameful to the exclusives, was simply the ordinary history of the place they called home. Slowly, almost without anyone deciding it, the colony was beginning to become a society in its own right rather than a prison with pretensions. Which brings us at last to the end of the story, or at least to the end of the beginning. Because the great experiment that had founded this lawless, drunken, sunburnt place could not last forever, and its closing chapter was already being written. Eventually the great convict experiment began to wind down. Transportation to the eastern colonies slowed and then stopped, and by 1868 the very last convict ship had delivered its final cargo to Australian shores. The colony that had begun as a dumping ground for the unwanted was quietly becoming something else entirely, a society finding its own feet, its own laws, and its own identity. The rum monopolies faded, the goldfields settled, and the lawless frontier slowly, grudgingly, began to organize itself. The people who survived all of it, the convicts, the settlers, the workers, and the dreamers, had endured starvation, brutality, and the raw chaos of building a world from almost nothing. And against every reasonable expectation, they had managed to lay the foundations of a nation. The end did not come all at once. Transportation to the eastern parts of the colony was halted first, as free settlers, grown numerous and confident, increasingly objected to living in what they saw as a vast open-air prison. They wanted respectable communities, not a steady supply of convicts, and their voices carried weight. One region after another closed its doors to the convict ships, until at last, far to the west, the final vessel unloaded its prisoners, and the long flow of the transported came to its quiet end. After 80 years, the experiment was simply over. What it left behind was something its founders had never quite intended. They had meant to create a remote receptacle for unwanted criminals, a place to file away a problem. Instead, they had created a society, complex and growing, with farms and towns and trades, with families and churches and quarrels over fences, with a native-born generation who knew no other home. The colony had outgrown its grim original purpose the way a child outgrows a hand-me-down coat, and it was reaching for something larger. The lawlessness, too, began to recede, though never entirely. The rum monopolies that had once run the place lost their grip. The goldfields, after their feverish years, settled into more orderly mining, and the towns that grew up around them. Proper systems of law and government slowly took hold, imperfect and often unjust, but real, replacing the chaos of convict constables and absent authority. The frontier remained rough for a long while yet, but the raw, anything-goes anarchy of the early decades was passing into memory and legend. And then there was the matter of the convict past itself, which the new society spent a long time trying to forget. For generations, descendants of the transported hid their origins in shame, eager to bury any connection to the chains and the lash and the long voyage out. The exclusives had won that argument, at least for a while, casting the convict heritage as something to be quietly ashamed of. It took a great deal of time before that shame curdled into something else, before people began to look back at their convict ancestors, not with embarrassment, but with a kind of awe. Because when you truly consider what those people endured, awe is the honest response. They survived the voyage, the hunger, the labour and the cruelty. They built shelter from bark and dirt, fed themselves from barren soil, and somehow kept going in a place that seemed determined to be rid of them. They were petty thieves and desperate poor folk, the discarded and the unwanted, and out of almost nothing they raised the beginnings of a country. That is not a heritage to hide. That is a heritage to marvel at. So as the last convict ship faded into history and the colony turned toward its future, the long, harsh, lawless chapter you have lived through tonight finally drew to a close. The chains were struck off, the frontier slowly tamed, and the place that began as the dumping ground at the edge of the world quietly became a home. And with that, our journey through the wildest corner of the 1800s is nearly at its end. So let the fire die low, and let your eyes grow heavy as we gather up what all of this was really about. Let's talk about how the convicts actually spoke, because they did not, as it happens, talk quite like you. Drop a fresh arrival into a crowd of seasoned prisoners, and you would catch maybe one word in 5, because the convict underworld carried its own secret language across the ocean, a thieves' slang known as the flash, and it was busily reinventing the English tongue from the inside out. Listen in on a conversation between two old hands, and you would hear something that sounded like English wearing a disguise, full of words you almost recognized doing jobs you could not begin to guess. It was a code, a culture, and a quiet act of rebellion all rolled into one. The flash language had not been invented in the colony. It had crossed the sea in the heads of the transported, carried from the rookeries and back alleys of the old world where the criminal classes had spent generations developing a private vocabulary. The whole point of it was concealment. If the law could not understand what you were saying, the law could not use your words against you, and a pickpocket discussing his trade in plain English was a pickpocket asking to be caught. So the underworld built itself a language that outsiders could not follow, and the colony, packed with the products of that underworld, became one of the great living museums of it. The vocabulary was a delight of misdirection. A man was a cove. The police, or anyone in authority, might be traps, because catching people was the job. To be transported was to be lagged, and a convict was a lag. Your bundle of possessions was your swag, a word that wandered out of the underworld and straight into ordinary speech, where it lives to this day. There were words for stealing, words for the stolen, words for informers, words for the gallows, an entire shadow dictionary covering every aspect of a life spent on the wrong side of the law. To speak it fluently was to announce, quietly, exactly who you were and where you had been. It was more than a practical code, though. The flash language was a badge of belonging, a way of marking the line between those who had lived the criminal life and those who merely studied it from above. To use the words correctly was to claim membership in a brotherhood of the transported, a culture with its own slang, its own humour, and its own grim pride. In a colony designed to strip people of identity and reduce them to labour, this private language let convicts hold on to something the system could not confiscate, a shared way of speaking that belonged to them alone. The authorities predictably hated it. A secret language among the people you're trying to control is an obstacle and an insult both, and the colony's officials regarded the flash with deep suspicion. One enterprising convict even compiled a dictionary of the slang, an attempt to translate the underworld for the benefit of those struggling to understand the people they governed, which has the distinction of being among the earliest such works produced in the colony. Apparently the surest sign your prison population has a thriving culture is when someone has to publish a glossary just to keep up. In the end, the flash language did what living languages do. It leaked. Word by word, it seeped out of the criminal class and into the everyday speech of the colony, until expressions born in the thieves' dens of the old world were being used by perfectly respectable people who had no idea where they came from. The convicts were gone, but their words stayed behind, woven quietly into the way the whole place talked, which is a fittingly cheeky legacy for a population that was never supposed to leave a mark on anything at all. Let's talk about the colony's idea of public entertainment, which had an unfortunate habit of involving a rope, a scaffold, and a large appreciative crowd. In an age before screens, before stadiums, before any of the distractions you take for granted, a public execution was a genuine event, and the authorities staged them out in the open precisely so that everyone could watch. People gathered, people jostled for a good view, and people treated the grim proceedings as a day out. It is a deeply uncomfortable thing to consider, but the gallows was, for a long stretch of colonial history, one of the most reliable shows in town. The logic behind the spectacle was deterrence. The colony believed, as most societies of the era did, that punishment worked best when it was seen, that the surest way to discourage crime was to make an unforgettable example of the criminal in front of as many eyes as possible. so executions were public by design, conducted in open spaces where crowds could assemble, the whole event arranged as a stern moral lesson with a captive audience. The condemned man was not simply put to death. He was put to death as a performance, a warning written in the worst possible terms for everyone watching to read. The trouble with using death as theatre is that audiences are not always as edified as you would hope. The crowds that gathered for a hanging were a mix of the genuinely solemn, the morbidly curious, and the frankly entertained, and the atmosphere could tip from grim to carnival with disturbing ease. Vendors might work the crowd, conversations carried on, and the whole grisly business took on the air of an occasion rather than a tragedy. The authorities had hoped to fill the people with sober dread. Often enough, they had instead provided a free afternoon's diversion. Hanging was the headline act, but the colony had a whole supporting program of punishments designed to grind a man down without quite killing him. There was the tread wheel, a vast revolving device that convicts were forced to tread endlessly, climbing a staircase that went nowhere, hour after exhausting hour, labour engineered to be as pointless as it was punishing. There was the iron gang, where men toiled at hard labour while shackled in leg irons, dragging the weight of their chains through every step of the day, the metal chafing and the work unrelenting. The colony had an inventive streak when it came to suffering. What made it all the more sobering was how minor the offences behind the harshest sentences could be, a legacy of the old world's enthusiasm for severe punishment over modest crimes. A society that would transport a person across the planet for stealing cloth was not inclined toward leniency once that person reoffended, and the penalties escalated with a logic that valued example over mercy. The result was a system in which the gap between a small mistake and a terrible fate could be alarmingly narrow, and everyone living under it knew it. There is a temptation, looking back, to treat all this as a kind of grim curiosity, a relic of a crueler age. But behind every public execution was a real person meeting a real end, and behind every cheering crowd was a society that had decided suffering should be watched. The colony staged these spectacles believing they made people better. Whether they did is doubtful. What is certain is that they reveal something stark about a place where death itself had been turned into a public lesson, performed on a schedule for a crowd. And that grim theatre was only one of the many ways the colony reminded its people exactly how little their lives were worth. Let's talk about money once more, because beyond the famous reliance on rum, the colony had a coin problem so severe it eventually drove the authorities to start deliberately vandalising currency just to keep it in the country. You already know the settlement was perpetually short of proper money. What you may not appreciate is just how chaotic the day-to-day reality of paying for things became, or the gloriously strange solution the colony eventually cooked up. It is one of those historical details that sounds invented and is entirely true, the sort of thing that happens when desperate people are handed a problem with no good answer. The root of the trouble was simple. Hardly any official coinage made its way to the colony, and what little did arrive refused to stay put. Coins were used to pay for imported goods, and promptly sailed away on the next ship, draining out of the settlement as fast as it trickled in. The colony was left scrabbling for any medium of exchange it could find, and the result was a financial free-for-all. Foreign coins of every nation circulated side by side, their values guessed at and argued over. Promissory notes, which were really just handwritten promises to pay, passed from hand to hand like cash, with everyone hoping the original promiser was good for it. This was, as you can imagine, a recipe for confusion and fraud. A handwritten note is only as trustworthy as the person who wrote it, and in a colony stuffed with people who had been transported for dishonesty, trust was not exactly the local renewable resource. Sorting out the worth of a pocketful of mismatched foreign coins required the skills of a money changer and the patience of a saint. The whole system limped along on improvisation and optimism, which are charming qualities in a person and disastrous ones in an economy. Then came the solution, and what a solution it was. The colony managed to acquire a quantity of Spanish silver dollars, a respected and widely trusted coin, and the obvious worry was that these fine new coins would simply do what all the others had done and disappear overseas. So rather than let that happen, the authorities did something wonderfully literal. They took each Spanish dollar and punched the center clean out of it, turning one coin into two. The outer ring became one denomination, and the small disc punched from the middle became another. 2 coins from one, and crucially 2 coins that were useless anywhere else and therefore had to stay home. The ring earned the name the Holy Dollar, for the very obvious reason that it now had a hole in it, and the little punched-out centre was called the dump. It was a scheme of beautiful simplicity. By mutilating the coins, the colony made them worthless as international currency, which meant traders had no reason to ship them away, which meant the money finally stayed where it was needed. The colony had solved its currency crisis not by acquiring more money, but by damaging the money it had until the money gave up trying to leave. There is something deeply colonial about fixing a problem by breaking the thing causing it. For a time, the Holy Dollar and the dump circulated as genuine currency, 2 halves of a punctured Spanish coin holding together the colony's tattered economy. Eventually, as the settlement matured and proper money became more reliable, these strange mutilated coins faded from use, becoming curiosities rather than cash. But they remain a perfect little emblem of the whole improvised, chaotic, make-it-up-as-you-go spirit of the place, a colony so short on order that it built its money supply by drilling holes in someone else's coins and calling it a plan. An improvisation like that was not the exception in colonial life. It was very nearly the rule. So there it is, a single long day at the bottom of the world, and what a day it was. You arrived in chains for stealing something small, survived a voyage that smelled like the inside of a forgotten barrel, and washed up in a colony held together by mud, rum, and sheer stubbornness. You laboured under the lash, watched the soldiers stage a rebellion over liquor, dodge bushrangers, panned for gold, lost a fortune at the toss of a coin, and learned that the nearest law worth the name was an ocean away and not especially curious about your problems. It was harsh, it was chaotic, and somehow, against every sensible expectation, it was also the strange beginning of a home. It is easy to laugh at how absurd it all was, the punched coins, the secret slang, the constables who were themselves convicts. But underneath the absurdity sits something quietly remarkable. The people who lived through this were the discarded and the unwanted, the poor and the desperate, and out of almost nothing they endured. They built shelter from bark, fed themselves from stubborn soil, and kept going in a place that seemed designed to be rid of them. That is not a punchline. That is resilience, raw and unglamorous and real. So tonight, as you settle into your clean, quiet bed, with running water down the hall and a roof that does not leak with great enthusiasm, maybe spare a soft thought for those who came before. They survived the voyage, the hunger, and the chaos, so that the world could slowly grow gentler. History is gross and ridiculous and occasionally heartbreaking, but it is also proof that people are stubborn and hopeful and impossibly tough. Rest easy now. You have earned it. Good night.